Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Looks like we got people joining, so we'll give them a few minutes. But if you're already here, say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Hi, Britt. Hey, Ben. How are you? Frank's in Connecticut. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Lindsay. Actually, heat in Florida sounds pretty good right now. I'm sitting in the frigid Pacific Northwest. It's going to be warm this weekend, but we had hail yesterday. Hey, Tracy. Oh, lots of folks. Jody's in London. Hi there. Snow in Minnesota. Hey, Doug, I hope the skiing's been good there. All right, we'll give just one or two more minutes to get everybody in the room, then we'll kick off here. Okay, I think we're got a pretty good quorum. Should we kick off, Julie?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Let's do it. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces. A number of folks have actually been on this journey for the last couple of weeks with us, and there's a couple new folks in the room. We are kicking off our third in a series of change activation webinars. I know most of you, so I'll be very brief, but for those of you that don't know me, I'm Aric Wood. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Tigerhall and also the author of the Strategy Activation Playbook, which is really the source code for a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. A lot of this experience is coming from almost 20 years at the helm of change design firm Explain, where we worked with a number of Fortune 500 companies, large global organizations to design and implement change activation programs. And I've also worked inside industry in similar roles at places like Intuit and other tech companies principally. So, looking forward to the conversation today and sharing a little bit about our observations of what makes change activation successful. We're situating us for those of you that have are maybe joining for the first time. This is a series of webinars. The first one around the fundamentals of change activation. The second one last week was around the first phase of our approach called Envision, and it was about stepping back a few steps from the strategy to build out a clear leader-led story of what the vision is, what the future looks like, and why we're going there. And then today we're going to be focusing on discovery phase. How do we uncover the barriers to change and sort of map the terrain ahead so that we've got a better sense of where we're going and how to plan an activation plan that takes those discoveries into account. So that will be the focus for today. For those of you that come from an experienced design perspective or design thinking perspective, this will feel very familiar. We're going to talk a lot about research tools and ways to kind of uncover insights in an organization. And for those of you that this is new to, this is going to be a great change kit to put into your change skills. Our objectives today are pretty simple. Anytime you embark on a journey, it's good to know the terrain ahead. And one of the things that typically throws change initiatives off is not anticipating the barriers to change, having them surprise us, slow down our momentum. And if that happens too many times, that momentum gets slowed to a point where we've stalled. So what we want to do with the discovery phase is be smart about making investments early so that we can avoid those mistakes, avoid those challenges, mitigate those risks earlier on. We're going to focus first on how we understand the unique wants and needs of the key stakeholders. So not every stakeholder is the same. Everyone has different points of view. We want to understand what those are and understand what we need to do to kind of meet those folks to get them on board with this program. We want to identify the change capacity, the issues and the opportunities of the organization. So what does the organization's profile look like? Is this a change resistant, a change supportive organization? Is the culture aligned with where we're going? What are the things in the organization that we should be aware of and what might shift that we will need to adjust to? And then we also want to be thinking about the changes in the outside context. So what's going on outside of our walls? Maybe these are things that we can't control, But if we're aware of them and we prepare for them, we can either move with them or find out how to mitigate against them. And then, as we have in the last couple webinars, we'll share with folks afterwards the tools that we talk about today. So hopefully some of these go-to tools that I'm introducing today will be things that you can put to use right away. So first, though, as we have, I want to set the stage with just a quick question from the audience to understand kind of where you're coming from. So we're going to put up a poll. The question I'm asking is this: how personalized and tailored are the change communications programs in your company? So as you think about kind of the average change program that you're launching in the organization, what is the most common descriptor of kind of where you're at on this spectrum? Yeah, this poll should have a trigger warning. Thanks, Ian.
I'm
And
going to,
this is, yeah, sorry.
oh, I was about to say I'm going to give people a few more minutes. People are thinking hard on this one.
Yeah, yeah, go for the honest answer because we're just trying to get a sense of where we are on the spectrum.
All right, I think we're good. Here you go.
All right, let's see what do we got. Okay, so the big winner is that we create tailored communications for key groups or geographies. So about 55% of those of us in the room have seen our companies at least tailoring the program to take into account key stakeholder groups or maybe key geographies so that we're starting to at least adapt to kind of what's unique about that part of the organization. Um, a smaller amount, 21%, are actually creating customized campaigns by each targeted stakeholder group. So, the 80/20 rule is at work here. About 80% of organizations are not doing this, and only about 20% are. No one answered the final question around really getting down to the level of role, language, tenure, so on and so forth. So this is about typical of what we see in the world. We've got about a quarter of companies creating what I would call sort of the one size fits all program. We've got about half the companies doing some tailoring. We've only got about 20% of the world that's focusing on creating much more tailored change journeys. So this is not surprising. I think this is kind of the state of where things are at today. That said, I think this kind of sets up my most important point of view for today, which is that we have learned over time that one size fits all fits none. Those programs that are really focused on a sort of a one size fits all approach to change basically leave most people out, right? Because we're not focusing and we're not targeting in a way that's meaningful. And I always go back to the metaphor of thinking like a marketer. Just like in marketing, we need to think about our different target customers, their unique wants and needs. And then if we're advertising, we're going to be tailoring our communications, we're going to be tailoring our interventions, our touch points to speak to the wants and needs of each of those target customers. We need to do exactly the same thing with our own customers, which are the employees in our organization or the stakeholders in our organization. So, three key takeaways for today that I want to set up. First off, we want to tailor a program for each stakeholder group. We want to start being part of that 20% that's focused on tailoring because we know from research from lots of different organizations that give us a range of about 30 to 60% acceleration of change adoption when we deploy a tailored program versus a one size fits all program. When we ensure that the right messages are delivered in the right way to the right people at the right time, those audiences are starting to understand the what, the why, and the how in a logical order so that they can move up the activation curve. And when we don't tailor it in that way, it doesn't feel harmonious. It feels discordant. It's like watching different episodes of your favorite show in the wrong order, right? The second thing, and this is kind of a huge aha moment for folks. About half of the employees of the Fortune 500 are not speaking English as their first language. We have an audience that is largely multilingual, and in many cases, English isn't the first language, and yet the Fortune 500 predominantly communicates in English. So we're leaving a number of folks behind in the sense that not that they don't understand the communications, but we know that using a native language can actually improve comprehension, and retention rates by 20 to 30%. So if we can start to tailor our communications or our campaigns in the languages that they're going to be locally delivered in, or better yet, if we can allow them to consume the information in whichever language they prefer, we're going to have a significantly higher connection rate as well as retention rate with those folks. So this is a huge missed opportunity that we need to be thinking about. And then lastly, we also need to be thinking about how we adjust the fuel mix. And what I mean by this is if we think about communications as one element, if we think about capability building, learning and development, training programs as another element, if we think about sort of culture activation and change activation and sort of ways of working, these things are probably going to be comprehensively mixed into our programs, but each audience might get a different mixture of those things. One audience might just need to really understand what and why are we doing this and then ready to move to action. Whereas another audience might say, I understand why we're doing this, but I don't personally have the skills to move to that new way of working. What are you going to do to equip me with the capabilities to make this happen? And that group might need a much higher dose of that capability building. So we also need to be thinking about the fuel mixture, if you will, of those interventions or those building blocks that we're sharing with each audience. So with that, let's dive in a little bit. What I want to do is start to set us up for how we can get there, how we can start to think about how we tailor a program for each stakeholder group, how we start to speak their language, how we adjust that fuel mix in proper order so that instead of a one-size-fits-all plan, we're starting to see an activation plan that's tailored to the unique wants and needs of each of those audiences. So for a little bit of review, just briefly, back to the fundamentals of what is change activation, I want to again center us on the people. So change activation is the art and science of persuading people to align around, engage with, and adopt new ways of working in order to achieve a shared vision. We know the numbers. We know that only about 20% of those transformations that we launch are going to be successful in meeting their goals. We're still seeing about 80% of them fail. And what we're trying to do is get at the why of that, right? And my assertion is that we need to be focusing on people as the fulcrum in our change efforts. We've introduced the change lever as a concept, but very simply in review, every transformation is moving from a current state that we're in today to a future state we're trying to get to. Every consultant in the world can map the gap analysis between that current state and that future state and say, these are the activities we need to do to actually close that gap. But what we also as change leaders need to do is take to heart the fact that this is not a level playing field. This is actually more of a seesaw. And the amount of pressure that we need to put on the organization to achieve that transformation is a function of the fulcrum in the center. And that fulcrum is people. So we need to look deeply into the people in the organization and understand organizationally, is this an organization that is highly adaptive, ready for change, in which case we don't need to work quite as hard to push that lever down? Is this organization highly resistant, either as an organization or to our particular transformation, in which case there's more work to do, right? And so we need to mentally have this picture in our head and understand that if we don't do the discovery work to go in and measure this, we're likely to fail because we're likely to either over or under index on the activities that need to be done. And we're going to treat the organization like a monolith, when in reality, inside that triangle are lots of different organizations, different stakeholder groups who fall somewhere differently on the spectrum. So we need to tailor our approach to meet this reality. Our goal is to move people up the activation curve. So all of those stakeholder groups, regardless of where they sit, what they're doing, which type of change management approaches we're using, will still need to go through these phases in terms of how people change. They're going to need to go through a hear it phase where our communications are effectively helping them become aware of, understand, and start to accept the changes, the what and the why of what we're doing. Most of those folks are going to have to go through a learning phase where they're starting to acquire new skills or new ways of working, apply them, and then build that into internalization so that they understand this is better than the way I used to do it. Or if not, raise this isn't better. How do we redesign it so that it is? Right. So we need to engage people at this point. There's a lot of employee engagement happening here. And then and only then will people start to actually integrate this and make this their sort of new way of working. But I want to build on this because we've talked about this before and start to say another reason that we need to tailor our programs is that not everyone's going to go through this journey at the same pace. So we need to start as change leaders by looking at the stakeholder audiences in our organization and understand that these folks might be starting in different places. Some people, leaders, for example, we talked about last week, might already be well up the curve because they've been involved in planning it from the start. They're already well through the hear it and believe it phase. They're about to go into the live it phase. Other people haven't heard anything yet, so they're not even on the awareness spectrum yet. So, starting with that premise, we also need to know that going forward tomorrow, we don't necessarily need to get everybody to the same destination. So, for example, if we're doing a customer centricity initiative, let's say we're trying to really bring our organization into becoming much more consultative at the customer layer, making sure those customer facing folks have new skills and capabilities for critical listening, gathering voice of the customer, feeding that back into our organization to help the rest of our organization retool towards customer needs. We might look at two stakeholder groups in this case. We might look at those customer facing folks, maybe the customer success team, maybe the customer service team, maybe the sales team. We might also be looking at another group, maybe say the engineering team, who are actually building the product in the background. If we're going through this customer centricity initiative, where do we need them to be in the next 3 to 6 months? Well, the reality might be that we need those customer facing folks to get there faster. They're going to be the first line of contact with customers. They're the first ones that we need to understand that we're going to ask of you that you are a part of the feedback loop with customers. It's giving us the information, that's understanding customer wants and needs. It's helping us communicate this information back into our organization so we can retool ourselves. And so those folks need to, in that first phase of work, go right through that hear it phase to understand what we're doing and why. Maybe we need to be equipping them with more training, more learning, more development, more capability building so that they're acquiring new skills and new ways of working. And they've started to integrate it in their work because that's the group that has to get there first. Meanwhile, maybe another group, the engineers, for example, the developers, we want to take them on that same journey, but it's not critical that they're there in 3 months or 6 months. Maybe we don't need them there for 9 or 12 months. So maybe for those folks, we only need to actually get them through that communication phase. They need to be aware of what we're doing and why. They need to understand it, and they need to have accepted it so that they're ready when we start to integrate that voice of the customer to understand how they can integrate that into their daily work. Importantly, what this sets up is the notion that not only do we not have to create a one size fits all plan, we also don't need to hit 100% of the organization right out of the gates. We might need to make sure everyone in the organization is aware, but our investments can be very targeted at the most important groups that we need to move the farthest, fastest first. That gives us the ability to stretch our resources in a more logical and tactical way to build an activation plan that not only is going to be more effective, but actually is going to have a higher ROI. Because we know that if we get those critical audiences moving forward, joining that movement right out of the gates, that people are more likely to then join and follow as they see success. So, sort of core concepts that I want to make sure that we sort of take in before we start thinking about the how. I know folks are going to have questions, and I'm going to make sure that we've got good amount of time for Q&A after this. So if you've got questions, you can go ahead and start populating them in the chat. But once we get through some of the tools, we'll stop and we'll have a little bit of discussion both about the theory and the practice. So transitioning to the practice. If you buy everything I just said, so what we want to talk about now is then, okay, great. So how do we get there? How do we make this, how do we do this differently? Recall that we said of our 4 phases, most organizations jump right from execute off. What we want to do is go back a few steps, think like researchers, think like designers, and do a couple of things well first. We want to make sure that we have gone back and set a clear story of what is the vision and why are we going there. Made sure that we've got all of our leaders understanding that I need to tell this vision story before anyone's ready to understand the strategy. And I need to be able to do that consistently as well as talk about the measurements of how we know where we are in the journey. We're now in the second phase, discovery, which I think is typically one of the most under-resourced areas for us as change leaders. But it makes total sense that we should do this, right? We would never depart on a journey across the country or to another land without actually doing some research, figuring out the map, understanding what the terrain ahead looks like, understanding maybe where the obstacles are, and then planning a route that's going to get us most efficiently from point A to point B. And yet we do it all the time with our change programs. So what we want to do today is talk about the discovery phase and the antidote to that problem. Then and only then, if we've actually surveyed that terrain, do we now have the list of the obstacles, the opportunities, the chutes and ladders, if you will, that are going to help us mitigate the risks and get there faster. And we're going to bring that into the design phase, which we're going to talk about next week. So last week we talked about Envision. Today we're going to really dive deep in discovery. And so discovery is all about mapping that terrain ahead and the barriers to change so that we can make sure that we have our best chance of building momentum and keeping momentum because we've anticipated the unique wants and needs of stakeholders. We've anticipated the potential obstacles and barriers to change and found ways to mitigate them, go around them, or ignore them in some cases. And we also know what forces might be working for and against us in the environment so that we're not surprised by them. So to that end, starting to introduce some of the tools that we would think about. First framework in the discovery phase is that I encourage folks to think about discovery in three lenses. The first lens is the stakeholder lens. We want to be looking inside the organization and understanding who are the most critical people that we need to have on board for this change. So back to that example, this is a customer centricity initiative. Everyone's important, but I know that that first line customer facing set of stakeholder groups are going to be most important first. And here's why. And then we want to look closely at those folks and understand what are their wants and needs. What are we going to have to do to get them prepared to change their ways of working so that they can sort of lead this charge? So stakeholder analysis is the first thing that we're going to do. The second thing we want to do, and these next two are oftentimes forgotten because it's someone else's job, but it's our job, and I'll share why. We need to look at the organization. We need to understand if we make this change here, what else is going to happen elsewhere in the organization? Are there emergent outcomes because we're implementing a new system here, but we haven't thought about this aspect or that aspect of how it's going to change the organization? Because those are also barriers to change. So it might mean that we're going to uncover some barriers to change where we're going to need to go work with our peers in other parts of the organization to say this change is going to impact you and let's work together to figure out how to mitigate this risk. So we want to look at that organization and understand where that fulcrum is in terms of the resistance to change or the openness to change, and also understand what else will change so that we can anticipate that. And then lastly, the third lens is we need to go out yet one more ring and think about the context around us. So we don't exist in a bubble. The world outside of us is going to shift. So we need to be aware of what are those potential forces that might act against us that we can anticipate and at least have a mitigation plan for. But also, what are those potential opportunities? What if some other aspect of our context shifts that's a force for us and might actually give us an opportunity to move faster? We want to make sure that we're prepared to take advantage of that if that comes. So let's dive into a set of specific approaches that we can use to do this work. As I have in the past, I'm a big fan of canvases because not necessarily because they're the best tool, but they're the best way to describe an exercise. So the goal of this exercise, in this canvas that I'm sharing is the Hoodoo canvas, is to really start to break down who are our key audiences, what do we need them to do or change or do differently, and then at the heart of it, where do we have to approach those folks? How do we have to support them? What do they need to understand to get from where they're at today to what we want them to do? So you can work with your teams with this framework, whether it's literally this worksheet, whether it's an exercise in a conference room, whether it's a conversation. But what you want to do is for your change, from the point of view of your change, understand who are the audiences for this particular change that are most critical. Maybe make a list of all those audiences and then prioritize them. You might find from that exercise then that, oh, these three customer facing audiences are the most important ones to work with first. And yes, these other audiences are important, but they're not quite as important, or we maybe don't need to invest as much in them. That's our goal. If we can get to that list of the who's prioritized, we can then go over to the right side and start thinking about what do we want them to do? Maybe leaders, we need them to be on the front lines advocating for the change. Maybe we need to have budget holders resourcing our efforts. Maybe we need to have frontline folks changing their behaviors or their ways of working. Maybe for other folks, we just simply need them to not be a blocker. We want to identify the most important do for each of those audiences. And then we can go back and understand in the center, what do we need them to understand to get there? What are the things that we will need to introduce to them, either from a communications perspective or a capability perspective or something else, so that they actually can bridge that gap? We might find out, for example, that one audience is totally on board, but just says, I just don't have the skills to do this. Are you going to give me the training? Great. We know that that audience's fuel mixture is going to be heavily based on capability building, whereas a different audience might be much more focused on, I need to understand the what and the why of this. So then we're going to be maybe more communication focused. You can go one level deeper in this work by applying a look at each one of those stakeholder groups. So introducing now another worksheet called the empathy map. The empathy map was actually created at Explain, my former home, but this is now a tool that's used pretty regularly in user-centered design work to start to get inside the head of organizations and the people inside. We can take any one of those stakeholder groups and start understanding what is it that they're feeling, what is it they're saying, what is it they're doing, but also we want to say, what are they thinking, what are they feeling, what maybe are they afraid of, what do they feel as a risk? By doing the empathy map exercise, we can reveal some things that are going to help get people off the fence. When we launch any initiative, what we tend to see is maybe 20% of people jump into it ready to go, 20% hold back and are resistant. But it's the ones in the middle that we need to work on. It's the ones that are sitting on the fence, maybe saying, sure, I'm on board with this change, but thinking in the back of their head, let's just wait and see. This might be the flavor of the month, and I'm going to see what happens. We want to get to that depth of understanding by talking to each of those stakeholder groups so that we can deepen our knowledge of what their potential fears are, what their anxieties might be, what their motivations are, and that will help us craft a better plan. So if we get at the stakeholder level and we understand not only the groups and their unique wants and needs, but specifically within those groups, what are the stakeholders' feelings, motivations, fears, and anxieties, we can now start to build a pretty clear picture of what types of interventions we need to introduce for that particular audience. So those understanding of different wants and needs in the stakeholder are sort of critical to our work. The second thing we want to do is look at the organization. So not only do we want to understand where they are on that fulcrum, are they resistant to change? Are they adaptive to change? Is the culture in support of this or against this? We also want to understand if we make this change, what else might shift? So for example, in this case, we might use a tool like the 8 dimensions of the organization. And this is a conversation piece that we can have with a group of leaders of different functions to say, all right, let's say we're going to introduce a new CRM system. So I'm now talking about a transformation around the CRM system, this quadrant of the organization. But what else is going to change? If we introduce that new system, do we have to shift our processes, for example? And who's tasked with that? Do we have to actually change any of our skills or attitudes in terms of the workforce? Do we need to make investments in that? What about our behaviors? Is the org structure going to shift or be in some way different because of this implementation? Each of these dimensions are dimensions that could possibly shift as a result of the change. And what we typically see in organizations is the change leaders tasked with get the people on board, but isn't typically thinking this broadly around, oh, I need to make sure that I'm actually working with this audience over here as well, because for us to get this standing, we need to invest over here. A quick example of this, we were doing a customer centricity initiative with a large global company, and they were very focused on how do we actually improve our customer experience, but they didn't have a measurement system for it. So literally there was no CRM system and there was no system to measure what ultimately became Net Promoter Score as their measurement system. So doing this exercise early in the planning led us to, yes, we're going to stand up this transformation, but hey, IT group, we need to go out and actually bring in an improved CRM system that allows us to track customer sentiment. So had we not done this work, we would have gone through the process and probably stalled, had to regroup and start again. So if we uncover those barriers to change, this gives us the opportunity to understand where are there potential things that could stop us or slow us down. And we're not going to hit them all, but if we can mitigate as many of them as possible, we're less likely to stall our program. If we can anticipate a bunch of them and get ahead of that, we're going to have fewer surprises as we go, and we're going to be able to keep the momentum with our teams. And then the last one is context. So I don't know if anyone's looked at their 401k today. I'm sorry. But if you recognize that we don't live in a bubble and that the things in the outside world are going to impact us, we really want to focus on understanding them in advance so we can mitigate those. And for this analysis, I think SWOT analysis is probably the most commonly known tool. I like to use something called the force field analysis because it takes into account not only the things that could work against us, but those things that could be accelerants for us. So, what are the forces that are working for us? If we think of the sailboat as a metaphor, headwinds are going to slow us down, tailwinds are going to accelerate us. We want to identify those headwinds. What are the forces that could work against us? Is it tariffs? Is it the market? Is it regulatory environment? We also want to understand what are the forces that could be working for us. If this happens, what could put some wind in our sails and actually help us to go faster? An example that I will share on this is that I was working with the leadership team of Mural, the onboard collaboration platform that competes with Miro and Whiteboard, or Zoom Whiteboard and others, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And we were also working with a large cruise line. So when the pandemic is just a force. But for the tourism company, the hospitality company, that force was a decimating force against. It actually cut their business down by over half right out of the gates. Whereas for the mural team, the pandemic was actually an accelerant. When we started on our strategic planning process right before the pandemic and the pandemic hit, with that company, that force four basically accelerated our 5 year plan into almost a 90-day plan. So the same forces can act differently based on the context of your transformation. And we want to start to capture what those are so that we're prepared for them. And then lastly, and most importantly, we now need to synthesize our learnings. So by doing all of this discovery and looking through those three lenses, we're going to identify lots of information. Now we need to synthesize that and prioritize and to say, what are the most important, what are the, 5 or 6 most important things I learned from stakeholder insights that is going to inform my plan for how I'm going to tailor things uniquely for each audience? What are the organizational insights that I took away and the risks that I can potentially mitigate or work with folks across the organization to mitigate so that those don't slow us down as we proceed? What about the context? Do we need to prepare for tariffs? Do we need to prepare for a regulatory shift? Are there things that we know are coming up in terms of our, labor negotiations that we maybe need to keep in mind as we do this? Are we doing a brand launch that might inform when all of our milestones have to happen? Those kinds of insights are important. And then what we want to do is summarize that into the actions that we're going to take. And I like to think of this as our requirements document going into design. This is where we're starting to take all of those learnings and put them into a set of requirements that describes what's unique about the program we need to create. Which audiences do we need to work with and how? What are the things that we might need to implement across the board to make this successful? What's missing? What do we actually have to start to work in advance before we launch? Those requirements will be completely different from one transformation to the other. And the goal of the discovery phase is to identify those requirements and document them so that as we go into our next phase, the design phase, we're equipped with really clearly chartered goals. One note before we sort of wrap up some of the conclusions and get to Q&A. Research is, as I said, one of the things that is most typically skipped because of cost constraints. But it's also one of the areas where we should be able to build the strongest business case. So whenever people say, yeah, I'm not going to have the budget to go out and actually do this work, my response is, how can we do it in maybe an 80-20 kind of way? Maybe we can't go out and survey the entire company. Maybe we can't take the time to set up a bunch of long focus groups. But are there ways that we can actually get some of this information, even if they're simply small conversations? So there's lots of different ways to do this. Some of the ways that I most typically see organizations successfully deploying it at relatively low cost. Can the change leaders go out and do structured interviews? Can we actually go out and just have a series of conversations with not even hundreds, but maybe 3 or 4 of the stakeholders in each of those stakeholder groups to at least validate our assumptions? Better yet, to actually learn from those folks so we can tailor our assumptions. Can we use surveys? Are there surveys that already exist that we can use or assessments that we can already put in place that we can maybe ride along on to get data that we need? Can we stand up a couple focus groups or better yet workshops where we can get people engaged in talking about the changes and thinking about and thinking through what are the various ways that we might take this plan and make it even better. Something that I personally love to do is card sort exercises. You can, if you need to get information really quickly, you can put out a bunch of the things you're fishing for on index cards, hand it to an executive and say, sort this into hits and misses. Which of these things resonate with you in our organization today? Which of these things don't? Which of these things might be risks for us in the future? Which of these things are going to shift if we implement this plan? And rather than an interview where they feel like they have to maybe reveal information they're not comfortable with, if they're simply just picking up cards and going this, and this, they'll tell you very quickly a story. Um, One example of this is that I had a CEO who was trying to really build a more empowered culture. And I did a card sort exercise with the leadership team and asked what was the biggest barrier to that change. And the card that came up consistently was tops down culture. And we were able to sit there with the leadership team and have a very meaningful conversation around the CEO being really the core issue of how we were going to fix this program. And that helped us actually, as a management team, get there much faster. Probably couldn't have done that without a quick exercise like this. And then lastly, observation. We can learn a lot just by walking the halls. If we're walking around an organization and understanding where do these stakeholders sit, what is their context, how do they learn information, we're going to understand that even the communication vehicles that we use or the means of learning new information are going to be really important. People might not be sitting in front of a laptop all the time. Maybe the way they need to actually learn something new is to give them a pocket guide that they can carry with them in the field. We don't know that unless we're actually out there observing it. And we as change leaders can sometimes just make assumptions that everybody's got a laptop when they don't. So observation is an important key. So bringing all this together, as we're moving towards execution, we've made now in the last 2 weeks two major new investments. One, we've taken the leadership team back 2 steps and said, let's talk about the vision and let's build a common story for where we're going and why. We've now moved into the discovery phase and we've done some research to really understand what is changing for whom, what are those stakeholders' wants and needs, what is the organization and what is unique about the organization and its potential barriers to change, what in the outside context might impact us. And we've now summarized all that content into an insights document that captures the requirements that we want to bring in to the design phase. And importantly, again, thinking in contrast to how a lot of plans are built, now you can imagine that if you've done this work and next week we're going into the design phase, we're now coming in with a really good map of the terrain ahead. We know what we need to go around. We know where we can go faster. We know what we need to go through. We know where we need to build a bridge. And we can now, in the design phase, which is where we're headed next week, take that activation plan and insert the right building blocks in for the right folks at the right time to ensure that we now have that tailored program that we can execute with much greater success than we might have otherwise. Before we dive into discussion and a couple takeaways, just a couple of pictures of what this looks like. This stage is all about conversations. It's all about getting out there, rolling up the shirt sleeves, and learning from folks. Some of that's by observation. So the example I have in the bottom left is we worked with a a global energy company, and part of the observation effort was to realize field workers, one of our major target audiences, and oh, these folks actually aren't sitting at desks, don't have laptops. The place that they convened was the cafeteria. It was the only place during the daytime where they came together, and it's where they learned their information. It's where they had conversations. It's where they integrated information. So we had to be thinking about each of our stakeholder groups from a perspective of how do we actually get this information to people in offices versus how do we get this information to the people in Prudhoe Bay. This is an example of that observation skill set. Other things that are useful, I talked about card sort exercises, sort of here in the center. We talked about games. Games are a really interesting way to simulate a change and then see how people react to it and how they debrief, what was good, what was bad, what will change, what will impact them. Creating sort of team workshops where teams can come together and maybe look at a plan and then provide their leader feedback. What do we like about it? What do we fear about it? What are the risks? Those kinds of themes can come back to us. We can also actually engage people in looking at the plan itself and inviting them, help us make it better. This will reveal the things that people are energized around and it'll reveal the things where maybe there's gaps in our thinking that we need to actually close. All of these are ways to bring people together to surface the kind of insights that we need. And as much as I'd like to say you've got to spend 3 months doing this, if you invest 2 weeks to do a series of focus groups, workshops, conversations, you're going to be significantly farther ahead than most of your peers that are leading change. So, final takeaways for today. The first one, I'd like to make sure that we always view the impact through all three lenses. Not only what are the unique wants and needs of the stakeholders, but what are the potential barriers to change elsewhere in the organization? And what's potentially happening outside that could either be a force for or a force against us so that we can either mitigate the risk or take advantage of the opportunity when it presents itself. Secondly, we want to look deeply at those barriers to change and anticipate which ones could actually slow our progress. This is probably going to get us out having conversations with other leaders in the organization to say, hey, as we're bringing this change on, this might cause a shift in this particular area. What can we do together to mitigate that risk so that we're all successful? And then thirdly, you want to make sure that there's a strong synthesis phase where you're taking all this information you've gathered and you're prioritizing it into a list of key requirements. We're going to learn more than we can act on. But we need to understand these are the critical levers that we must act on for us to be successful. And then we want to bring that into our planning phase and the design phase so that we're creating a customized and tailored approach that meets the needs that those requirements have defined. And in closing, just remember one size fits none. So for those of us that are still in organizations leading one size plans, we need to really be advocates for the concept that every stakeholder group is going to need a tailored approach. There's a reason that those 20% of people that are doing that are the group that are the successful group. And so we have the data, we have the evidence. Now we need to persuade our leaders and persuade folks that there's a business case for us to make these kinds of investments. So with that, I thank you. I'm going to make sure to share both this deck as well as the worksheets that we talked about out with the audience. So hopefully you can get using them. If people have questions about this, by the way, I've had a couple people do so. Feel free to reach out anytime, and I'm happy to kind of talk through experience of working with some of these exercises, maybe other ideas that might work in your organization. And with that, I think we're going to open the floor to some questions. So why don't I go to Julie? Is there anything that's really coming through in the chat that we should address first?
Great. So we have three questions in the chat. The first one is from Maduri. Is org analysis a precursor to stakeholder analysis? Are they sequential? What comes before the other?
It's a great question. In my experience, they don't have to come before one another. I always describe this as a freaky circle. So it's not a linear process. What I found in the research phase is that we might go out and be talking to stakeholder groups, and they might reveal something about the organization that we didn't know. And then we have to go back to our org analysis and say, oh, we just learned that there's no measurement system for, customer sentiment. How do we actually build that? And then we might go back. So I would suggest that, in my experience, the best bet is actually to look at all three lenses and kind of run them simultaneously, and then put some checkpoints in with if it's just you or if it's you and a team to say, what did we learn over here? Does that impact something over there? And then maybe go back and dig deeper. What we're going to see is that those dependencies will become apparent and revealed by doing that. But we do have to sort of be agile about our research approach. Thank you. It's a great question.
Ryan has a question. Can you provide your perspective on how you differentiate between behaviors and skills?
Yes. So if you're referring to the 8 dimensions of the org, we think of skills as sort of the capabilities that are learned, right? So do you have the skill to lead a consultative conversation with a customer rather than a transactional customer? Because we can help build those skills for you. If you don't have those skills, we can invest in you to actually grow those skills. Behaviors oftentimes are more around sort of attitude or mindset towards a thing, right? So I'm resistant to change versus I embrace change is a behavior that's learned over time. But it also has a very strong component of culture in it. And so when we're sort of teasing those things apart, we think about if we need to make a behavior shift, it's really getting people's minds changed around their way of working to do something different on Monday morning than the way they did it last week. And oftentimes we're thinking there more about culture interventions, whereas with skills and capabilities, we're oftentimes thinking more about learning and development interventions to actually equip people with the skills to do things in a new way. They definitely overlap, without a doubt. But that would be my quick answer.
Excellent. So we have a question from Sarah. I feel like you kind of answered it, but if you want to add more detail to it. Essentially, she asks, I recognize culture can kill strategy or targeted change. Could you provide an example of how you dealt with that, especially with senior leadership who just want to execute and are actually feeding current culture?
Oh, that's a whole webinar. So I would say, I've this where this pops up the most in my experience is when I've worked in mergers and acquisition transformations, where we're bringing two companies together, because then you basically are standing up and making quite visible the differing cultures. And I think my answer is the same in both cases, which is when you identify that culture is either an accelerant or an obstacle to your change, it really does require a lot of going back to the leadership team to saying we need to make some decisions about what we want our culture to be. So much like in the envision phase, we went back with the leadership team and said, we need to go back a step from the strategy and revisit our vision. What is our vision? How do we tell a common story? I would put culture very much in that same category of culture will absolutely kill a transformation if it's not addressed. If we find that that culture is one of the opposing forces or barriers to change, what we might have to do with the leadership team is identify what are the barriers to change in the culture, what are the opportunities in the culture, and what's our commitment to communicating what the culture is, and then building that reinforcement into the plan. Because it might be, unfortunately, that sometimes people will shift their behaviors to align with the culture that we want to create, but sometimes they won't. And that might have to be okay. We might have to basically transform the organization towards the vision of the culture we want rather than focusing on the one we have today. And that requires getting the leadership aligned and consistent around saying, we're committed to X, Y, and Z, and we're going to make sure that all of our incentives, all of our goals, all of our planning, all of our behaviors align with that. And as I say, I've seen this most often come to the fore when we're doing mergers and acquisitions, because in those cases, you're oftentimes seeing you're having to make choices. You're having to say, this is the culture this company works with, this is the culture that that company works with. Which one are we committed to? So it's a leadership conversation, and then it's leadership role modeling. Love that question. Thank you.
We have three more questions. On the synthesizing of insights, are you breaking down the stakeholder insights by stakeholder groups or just for stakeholders in general?
By groups for sure. Yeah, I mean, we what I've tried to do is break it down as much as possible. So, for example, in some cases, it might be as simple as that hoodoo list, where it's sort of like here's five stakeholder groups, what we want them to do, and their unique wants and needs. It might be kind of a crazy matrix where it's like five or six stakeholder groups, four or five geographies, five or six different languages. You got to go as deep as you need to go, right? And this is a classic case where you could continue to go all the way through, but I've always sort of coached people to use the 80-20 rule. We need to, get 80% of the way there to say how are we going to get to the most important groups here? In a smaller transformation, it might be just two or three audiences that we need to work with to make this happen, and they might be in the same geography. Whereas in another case, I'll give an example of an enterprise strategy that we were launching that affected a global company, where we actually created seven different programs to 5 to 10 different audiences, and we localized it in 7 languages. So the size and scope is really a function of the size and scope of your transformation and the organization that you're impacting. But at the minimum enclosure, I would get down to what are the wants and needs of each stakeholder group that is impacted, that is most critical for you to move up the activation curve. Thank you. Great question.
Here's the next one. How long have you seen the discovery stage typically last? A challenge we run into with our organization is that the change is happening really fast. Is there an iterative approach to what you presented today? It seems to be fairly waterfall.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be waterfall. Kind of as we touched on in the first one, we can, we can be doing this in a pretty rapid design sprint where we've got two or three different teams looking at things and then coming back and making the results. The reality is oftentimes we don't have teams, right? The reality might be your transformation team is two or three people. And so the thing I always encourage people to do is understand the time you've got and then design the best sprint you can accomplish in that time. For example, in an ideal world, yeah, maybe we'd spend 3 to 4 weeks with teams out really scouring the land and researching and doing focus groups and doing discussions or installing surveys and getting the results back. But we oftentimes don't have that much time. And so I've also seen be very successful just the maybe a 2 or 3 day sprint where we stand up a series of back-to-back focus groups or interviews with the key stakeholders that we want to validate our assumptions with. And we as a team first come up with this is what we think the stakeholder groups are, this is what we think their wants and needs are. And then we go out and talk to those folks and say, help us make this better, right? That's a really good 80/20 way to get close enough to have an insight, right? I think the limit is if you make all of these assumptions and you don't validate the assumptions with the stakeholder groups, that's when we failed. So, whatever we need to do to get there as quickly as we can, so long as we take our assumptions and we validate them with those key stakeholder audiences, either through individual interviews, through focus groups, through surveys, or casual conversations. I think you can do it in as little as a concentrated few days. Best case, couple weeks, and ideal case, which I almost never see, more than that. But the key is speed, and the key is speed not because perfect wouldn't be better. The key is speed because we know that as change leaders, we're being asked by leadership to go fast, and so we want to find the quickest, most efficient ways to do the research.
Thank you. So here is our last question for now. It's any suggestions for mitigating change fatigue?
Oh, change fatigue. It's only increasing too, right? So, we know that people we've been launching more and more change at people at faster and faster pace. And so fatigue is actually a real risk in and of itself. My one major suggestion here, and we'll talk about this a lot next week, so thank you for the segue. My major suggestion for next week, or for this issue, is think about when you're selecting the building blocks that we're going to put into the design, building blocks that aren't additive. What I mean by this is like if we know that people are complaining, I've got no time, I'm running 1,000 miles an hour, we don't want to create a 5 day offsite to try to take people off and go talk about our change. It's not going to flow. What are the ways that we can flow within their current ways of working? Can we install a 20-minute agenda for leaders to install in their weekly stand-up meeting with their audience that already is on their calendar, right? What are all basically the rails that have already been built in the organization that we can ride along? Are there video monitors in all the break rooms that we could actually put our messaging on? Are there existing meetings or connection points that we can insert some of this conversation? Let's ride those rails that are already built rather than introducing something new, because something new is expensive, right? And that will just contribute to the change fatigue rather than allowing us to honor and respect people's time and work within the ways that they're currently working as much as possible. So we're going to dig into that quite a bit next week. So I love that conversation. Where we're headed is the design phase. So we're going to start to bring it together. We're going to talk about the types of building blocks that you can think about for your campaign, different categories, 10 ways. We're going to figure out how to communicate this information 10 ways, 10 times with lots of different vehicles so that we're really getting the most out of these touch points and putting that into an activation plan that is tailored. How do we tailor that plan so that we've got something that actually looks like the plan that's going to reach our audiences, address their wants and needs, and allow us to get them up the activation curve as quickly as possible. So with that, I hope you'll come back next week to visit us for the design of the marketing plan for change. Following that, we'll finish up this series with execute, and then we're going to be talking about building a business case for change, as well as some best practices for leading change from the C-suite. So definitely hope you'll enjoy and join us again. And with that, I just want to thank you. Love sharing this time with you each Thursday. Do reach out to me if you've got any questions, if you've got follow-up, or if there's anything I can do to support you. I'm here as a service to you and really grateful for your time today. Thanks all.